1850. Filthy bloomers and frozen pea buckets. The disgusting reality of women in the Great White North intro. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine waking up in complete darkness. The air inside your tiny log cabin is so cold that your breath crystallizes the instant it leaves your lips, forming frost on your woolen blanket. You feel the rough texture of the straw-stuffed mattress beneath you, poking through the worn cotton ticking. The smell hits you immediately, a thick, pungent mixture of wood smoke, unwashed bodies, rancid animal fat, and something acrid and ammonia-sharp that makes your nostrils burn. That smell? That is the frozen contents of the chamber pot sitting 3 feet from your bed. And in about 30 seconds, you are going to have to use it. Welcome to the Canadian frontier, somewhere between 1815 and 1850. Welcome to a world that history books rarely describe in full sensory detail. Welcome to the daily reality of frontier women in the Great White North. A reality so harsh that most modern humans could not survive a single week. Today, we strip away the romantic notions of pioneer life. We are going to talk about things that made these women's existence almost unbearable. The frozen urine, the months without bathing, the underwear worn until it literally disintegrated, and the impossible challenge of menstruation in temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but these women deserve to have their full experience acknowledged. The setting: Canada's frozen wilderness. The Canadian frontier during the early immigration era was not the picturesque wilderness of paintings. It was a brutal, unforgiving landscape actively hostile to human existence. Picture a trading post settlement somewhere in what is now Ontario. The year is 1847. A woman named Margaret has been in Canada for 3 years now. She came from Ireland, fleeing the famine, dreaming of a better life. The reality has been different. Her home is a single-room log cabin, roughly 15 feet by 20 feet. The gaps between the logs are stuffed with mud, moss, and animal hair, but the wind still finds its way through. The only heat source is a cast-iron stove she must feed constantly. Her husband works at the trading post, sometimes traveling for weeks to collect furs. When he is gone, Margaret is alone. The temperature outside, on this January morning, is negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Exposed skin begins to freeze in under 10 minutes. Spit freezes before it hits the ground. Trees crack and groan, their sap frozen solid, sometimes exploding with sounds like gunshots in the night. Inside the cabin, despite the stove, the temperature hovers around 40 degrees near the fire and drops to below freezing in the corners. Ice forms on the inside of the window. The water bucket is frozen solid, a wooden ladle trapped in its surface. And Margaret has just woken up, her bladder screaming. The chamber pot, a frozen nightmare. There was no indoor plumbing. There were no toilets. There was not even an outhouse for most families. And using one in negative 40-degree weather was genuinely dangerous. Women could get frostbite on the most intimate parts of their bodies. People did die, frozen to death, attempting to relieve themselves outside during blizzards. So there was the chamber pot. Imagine a ceramic or metal bucket that sat in the corner of your one-room cabin. This is where you did your business, all of your business, throughout the long winter nights. Now imagine that chamber pot in negative 30-degree weather inside a cabin where the fire has died down overnight. The contents freeze. Margaret swings her legs out of bed, her bare feet hitting the wooden floor. So cold it feels like stepping onto ice. She shuffles across the cabin, her breath visible in great white plumes. The chamber pot sits in its corner. the contents from the previous day frozen into a solid yellowish-brown mass, the surface cracked and crystalline. The smell is still there, that sharp ammonia reek, preserved by the cold. But it creates a new problem. There is no room in the pot for more. She takes a knife, the same knife she uses to cut bread, and chips away at the frozen contents, breaking them into chunks that she carries outside. The chunks steam slightly through her wool mittens as her body heat thaws them. The smell intensifies. She does this every single morning. Every single morning, she chips frozen human waste out of a pot, carries it outside, dumps it in the snow. And this is just the beginning of her day. There was no toilet paper. Frontier women used dried corn cobs, old rags, scraps of fabric. In winter, these substitutes were often frozen, rough and abrasive, against already irritated skin. The impossibility of bathing. When did you last shower? This morning, probably. We have hot water at the turn of a tap, soap in a dozen varieties, soft towels, temperature-controlled bathrooms. Margaret has not bathed in 4 months. 4 months. 120 days without submerging her body in water. Without properly cleaning anywhere except, occasionally, her hands and face. Because bathing in the Canadian winter was nearly impossible. She would need to gather enough snow to fill a tub. Hours of hauling. Then melt that snow, requiring enormous amounts of firewood. A bathtub's worth of water might take an entire day to prepare. Then she would have to undress in a cabin hovering around 40 degrees near the stove and below freezing elsewhere. Her wet skin would begin losing heat immediately. By the time she finished washing, she could be hypothermic. It simply was not worth the risk or the precious firewood. So Margaret went from October until March or April without proper cleaning. Her skin developed a coating of oil, dead cells, and dirt. Her hair became matted and greasy, her scalp itching constantly. She scratched, and her fingernails came away with dark crescents of grime beneath them. The smell of her own body became so familiar that she stopped noticing it. But it was there, a heavy, musky odor of sweat and sebum, overlaid with wood smoke and the stench of the chamber pot. When her husband returned from his trips, he smelled the same way. They had both become nose-blind to their own stench. In spring, Margaret would spend an entire day on the process, heating water, scrubbing her skin until it was raw and red, watching the water turn gray and then brown with months of accumulated filth. But that spring ritual was months away. For now, she simply endured. The underwear nightmare, bloomers and beyond. Now we come to perhaps the most uncomfortable topic: undergarments. Modern women have comfortable, breathable underwear that can be washed easily and replaced inexpensively. Frontier women had none of this. In the 1840s, women wore bloomers, loose-fitting undergarments extending from the waist to below the knee. These were made of cotton or linen, expensive and incredibly difficult to clean in winter. Margaret owns 2 pairs of bloomers. Just 2. They must last her entire winter. Think about wearing the same underwear for weeks at a time. Think about the bodily fluids that accumulate: sweat, urine residue, vaginal discharge, menstrual blood. Think about the smell, the texture against your skin. In summer, Margaret could wash her bloomers in the river, beating them against rocks. But in winter, the river was frozen several feet deep. Even if she could chop a hole, submerging fabric would mean it would freeze the instant it was removed. She could try washing clothes inside with melted snow, but the garments could not dry. Hanging wet fabric in a cabin at 40 degrees meant it would remain damp for days, growing mildew. Sometimes the wet fabric would simply freeze stiff, So Margaret wore her bloomers until they could stand up on their own. That is not an exaggeration. The accumulation of body oils, sweat, and other fluids would literally stiffen the fabric. The crotch area would become crusty and discolored. The smell was indescribable. Ammonia from dried urine, the iron tang of menstrual blood, the general funk of unwashed fabric. When her bloomers became completely unbearable, Margaret would rotate to her other pair. But winter cleaning was never effective. She would scrub them with snow, which removed some surface dirt but could not penetrate the accumulated grime. By spring, both pairs were essentially destroyed, stained beyond recovery, worn thin, ties broken. She would have to make new ones, requiring fabric she could barely afford. Menstruation, the ultimate challenge. If everything we have discussed sounds difficult, consider this. The female half of the frontier population had to deal with monthly menstruation on top of everything else. In the modern world, menstruation is managed with disposable pads, tampons, menstrual cups, products designed for comfort and absorbency. Margaret had rags. That is it. Just rags. Old pieces of fabric, torn from worn-out clothing, which she would fold and pin inside her bloomers. These rags were reusable. They had to be, because fabric was too precious to throw away. Now picture this in a Canadian winter. Margaret's period arrives in January. She feels the familiar cramping, the warm rush of blood. She reaches for her rags, stored in a small box near her bed. The rags are stiff with cold, almost frozen. She has to warm them by the fire before they are soft enough to use, and even then, they feel rough against her most sensitive skin. The rag becomes saturated quickly. These old fabrics did not have the absorbency of modern materials. After a few hours, she can feel the wetness, the cold dampness against her skin. In sub-zero temperatures, this becomes dangerous. Wet fabric against skin in extreme cold leads to rapid heat loss. The dampness of the menstrual rag can actually lower her core temperature. She has to change the rags frequently, but each change means handling frozen replacements, dealing with used rags that must be stored somewhere. She cannot wash the used rags, not in winter. So she scrapes off what she can, hangs them near the fire to dry, and stores them in a bucket in the coldest corner of the cabin. The blood dries into rust-colored stains. The smell, when she opens that bucket, makes her gag even after years of exposure. Some women simply stored these rags until spring. Others burned them, sacrificing precious fabric. Neither option was good, and there was no ibuprofen for cramps, no heating pads beyond hot stones from the fire. Margaret curled around her cramps in a cabin where the walls were coated with frost, wearing undergarments stiff with frozen bodily fluids, and simply endured. The sound of isolation. Consider also the auditory experience of these frontier women. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of a quiet room, but an oppressive, almost painful silence that pressed against the eardrums. In deep winter, when the snow lay thick, the wilderness became completely still. No birds sang, most had migrated, no insects buzzed. The wind, when it died down, left a void of sound that felt supernatural. Into this silence came only a few sounds. The crack of trees freezing and expanding, like distant gunshots. The hiss of the fire, the creak of the cabin settling, and her own breathing, her own heartbeat, unbearably loud. Margaret had been alone for 3 weeks. Her husband had left to collect furs. She had not spoken to another human being in 21 days. She found herself talking to herself just to hear a human voice. She would narrate her actions aloud. She knew it made her seem mad, but the alternative, complete silence, was worse. At night, The wolves came closer, their howls echoing across the frozen landscape. She could hear them investigating the cabin, sniffing at the door, their claws clicking on frozen ground. She would lie in bed, heart pounding, a rifle beside her that she barely knew how to use. Sleep came in fragments. She would doze, then wake suddenly, convinced she had heard something. Every noise became magnified, examined, feared. And always, beneath everything, was that frozen silence. Washing clothes. The river in winter. Even when bathing was out of the question, clothes still needed to be washed occasionally. The outer garments accumulated grime that eventually became unbearable. And some things, like menstrual rags, absolutely had to be cleaned. The river was frozen, but beneath the ice, water still flowed. Margaret would wait for a slightly warmer day, perhaps -20 instead of -40, and venture out. She carried an axe, a bucket, and whatever clothes absolutely needed washing. The walk was exhausting. Snowdrifts reached her hips, and she stopped frequently, the cold air burning her lungs. At the river, she would break through the ice. The axe swinging was brutal work that left her shoulders aching and her hands numb. Eventually, she would break through to dark water, so cold it seemed almost viscous. She had to submerge the clothes in that water. She had to scrub them, wring them, but her hands would go numb within minutes. The clothes, once removed, would begin freezing immediately. Within seconds, ice crystals forming on the fabric. She would scrub frantically. The harsh lye soap barely lathered in the cold. Her hands turned red, then white as circulation cut off. She had perhaps 10 minutes before frostbite became real. By the time she reached the cabin, her laundry was a collection of frozen boards, stiff as wood. The thawing took hours. The clothes would drip continuously, creating puddles she had to mop up. And often, after all that effort, the clothes still were not truly clean. Some frontier women simply gave up on winter laundry. They wore the same clothes for months, hoping spring would come before the fabric rotted off their bodies. The physical toll. All of this took a tremendous toll on the female body. Margaret was 32 years old, but she looked 50. Her hands were permanently roughened from the cold, the skin cracked and bleeding, calluses thick on her palms. Her face was weathered, wind-burned, creased from squinting against sun on snow. Her hair was thin and brittle, breaking off in chunks. She kept it hidden beneath a cap. Her teeth were another matter. Without dental care, many frontier women lost teeth young. Margaret had already lost 3, one to an abscess that swelled her face for a week before her husband lanced it with a hot needle. Her skin, beneath layers of clothing she never removed, was a map of problems. Rashes where unwashed fabric rubbed. Infections where cuts went untreated. Raw, chapped skin where moisture accumulated. The lack of fresh food in winter led to vitamin deficiencies, bleeding gums, weakness, fatigue. She bruised easily and healed slowly. Sometimes getting out of bed seemed impossible, but she got up because the fire needed feeding and there was no one else. Mental health suffered equally. The isolation, the endless work, the brutal conditions, circumstances likely to produce depression, anxiety, and trauma. But in 1847, there were no such diagnoses. Only endurance. Or not. Some women did not endure. Some walked out into the snow and did not come back. Some simply stopped eating, stopped moving, stopped caring. The trading post. Other women. Once or twice during winter, if conditions allowed, Margaret would make the 3-mile journey to the trading post. A chance to see other human beings, to speak to other women. The trading post smelled of furs, the musky animal smell of beaver and fox, mixed with tobacco smoke and the ever-present odor of unwashed humans. Other women gathered there, Irish immigrants, Scottish settlers, French-Canadian wives of traders. They came bundled in layers of wool and fur, their faces chapped, hands rough, bodies hidden beneath so much fabric they moved like animated bundles of cloth. And they smelled. God, how they smelled. Margaret noticed it, even though she smelled the same way. When you stood close to another person for the first time in weeks, you noticed the human smell you had become nose blind to on yourself. No one mentioned it. Everyone understood. The women exchanged information while their husbands traded goods. How to stretch the last flower. Which herbs helped with female complaints. Whose baby had survived the winter, and whose had not. The infant mortality was staggering. Margaret herself had lost 2 children, one to fever at 6 months, one to breathing sickness at 2 years. The tiny graves outside the cabin covered in snow until spring. But it was common. Nearly every woman had similar stories. They did not cry, these women. Not in public. They absorbed the grief and kept moving, kept working, kept surviving. The return of spring. Imagine, then, the relief when spring finally came. It began slowly, temperatures rising from -30 to -10 to just below freezing. The ice on the window began to melt. The snowpack began to disappear in patches, and with spring came water. Running water, unfrozen water. Water for bathing, for washing, for cleaning everything that had gone months without attention. Margaret's first spring bath was almost religious. She heated pot after pot of water, filled the wooden tub, and lowered herself in. The warmth was almost painful after months of cold. The water immediately turned gray. She scrubbed herself raw. She washed her hair 3 times, watching the water go from brown to gray to clear. She scraped dead skin from her feet, cut her toenails for the first time in months. The feeling of being clean was so overwhelming that she wept. Sitting in that cooling bath water, pink and raw from scrubbing, she cried with relief and exhaustion. Then she washed her clothes, all of them. The bloomers, stiff with months of accumulated filth, went into the water. She scrubbed until her shoulders screamed. She hung the clothes on lines between trees, watching them dry in the sun. The menstrual rags she burned, every single one, fed to the fire while she watched with grim satisfaction. Spring meant survival. Another winter endured. Connecting past to present. Now think about your own life. This morning, you probably woke up in a temperature-controlled room. You walked to a bathroom where hot water flowed at the turn of a handle. You used a toilet that flushed away all evidence of bodily functions. You showered with water that stayed hot as long as you wanted. You put on clean underwear washed and dried by machines. You did not think about any of it. Margaret could not have imagined such luxury. It would have seemed like fantasy about a world that could not exist. The gap between her experience and yours is barely 170 years. Your great-great-great-grandmother might have been Margaret. These women survived conditions that would break most modern humans. They did it without complaint, without support systems, without modern conveniences. They did it because survival was the only option. And they did not just survive. They built the foundations of our society. Every time you turn on hot water, remember that someone's grandmother had to break ice on a frozen river just to drink. Every time you take a warm bath, remember that someone's ancestor went months without washing. Every time you use the bathroom in comfort, remember the chamber pot, the frozen contents, the knife chipping away at frozen waste. We owe these women more than we can ever repay. Conclusion: Margaret did not leave her name in history books. Neither did thousands of women like her. Women who crossed oceans to come to this frozen land, who endured conditions that would be classified as torture by modern standards. Their stories have been forgotten, sanitized, reduced to footnotes. Pioneer women, the textbooks say, were strong and resilient, but they do not describe the smell of months-old underwear, the sound of urine freezing in a ceramic pot, the feeling of menstrual rags stiff with ice pressed against raw skin. That is the truth we have told today. The sensory truth, the bodily truth, the disgusting and absolutely real truth of life for women in the Canadian frontier. These women were not saints or heroes in any romantic sense. They were human beings dealing with biological realities in impossible conditions. They bled and sweated and urinated and defecated, like all humans do. But they did it in a context that made every normal function into a survival challenge. And they made it work. They found ways to cope, to endure, to even occasionally laugh at the absurdity. They supported each other when they could, survived alone when they had to, and kept going when everything in them wanted to stop. So the next time you complain about a minor inconvenience, a cold shower, a less than clean restroom, take a moment to remember Margaret. Remember the chamber pot frozen solid. Remember the bloomers worn for months. Remember the rags, the frozen river, the silence pressing against the ears like physical weight. And be grateful. Be so deeply, profoundly grateful for the world you live in now, built on the frozen suffering of women who came before. They deserved better. They got what they got, and they survived anyway. That is the story of women in the Great White North. Untold.